When I first bought my land on the edge of the valley nearly 15 years ago, I never imagined that water, of all things, would become the source of so much conflict with my neighbors and their ever demanding homeowners association. The property wasn't luxurious, but it was mine, a wide stretch of rolling hills, a patch of thick woods that gave way to a meadow, and a narrow creek that snaked its way across the back end of the land. The creek had always been a humble thing, just a trickle most of the year. But during the spring thaw, it would swell and roar, pushing stones along its bed and feeding into a larger river that wound through the neighboring properties. Years ago, I constructed a small dam on my side, nothing industrial or massive, just a reinforced earth and stone barrier that pooled water into a large pond. I wanted the pond for two reasons. First, it created a stunning view from the porch of the house I built on the hill, and second, it served as a reservoir for irrigation since I grew vegetables, kept a few head of cattle, and maintained an orchard. Over time, the pond became a mini ecosystem of its own, home to ducks, frogs, and even fish I stocked myself. My neighbors occasionally admired it when they passed by, but the HOA, an organization I had never wanted to join but was coerced into when I built inside their zoning boundaries, looked at it differently. To them, my pond was unauthorized water control. For years, I paid their small fines and brushed off their warnings, figuring they'd eventually get bored. But they didn't. If anything, their hostility only grew worse after the region entered a drought. Suddenly, the once gossiped about pond turned into a hoarding station in their eyes, and I was painted as the selfish landowner who was stealing water from the community. Never mind that the dam only slowed the water, never stopped it entirely, and never mind that I had legal water rights going back decades before the HOA even existed. They didn't care about the law, only control. And control was their obsession. It started with notices tucked under my door, then certified letters accusing me of excessive resource manipulation, then threats of liens against my home. I ignored most of it, confident in my legal standing, until one morning when I came home from a supply run to find a bright red envelope nailed to the post at the end of my driveway. The letter inside declared that the HOA had investigated and confirmed ongoing violations regarding water retention and unauthorized dam construction. Their penalty? A staggering $50,000 fine to be paid within 60 days. If I didn't pay, they warned, they would initiate foreclosure proceedings to seize my land and restore community balance. I stood there in the driveway with the envelope in my hand, reading the lines over and over, each word making my blood boil hotter. $50,000 for what? For managing my own land, for improving it, for creating a reservoir that not only benefited me but the wildlife around it? I thought back to the countless community meetings I'd skipped because I couldn't stand their power-hungry posturing, and I realized this was their retaliation. They wanted me gone, plain and simple. They saw my independence as a threat to their micromanaged fiefdom, and the pond was just their excuse. That evening, I walked down to the dam with my dog, sat on the bank, and stared at the still water reflecting the pink and gold sky. The ducks glided in lazy circles, unaware of human squabbles. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. I thought about how much work I had poured into this land. Hauling stones by hand to reinforce the dam, planting trees to stop erosion, dredging the pond when it silted up, and making this place into something beautiful and alive. The idea that some board of retirees and busybodies could erase all that with a single fine made me laugh, then growl in anger. That's when the seed of an idea planted itself in my head. If they thought I was hoarding water, if they wanted to accuse me of stealing, then maybe I should give them exactly what they said they wanted. No more dam, no more pond, no more controlled reservoir. Let nature handle the flow of the creek, and let the HOA live with the consequences. I knew the terrain downstream better than anyone. They'd get far more than they bargained for if the water was suddenly released after years of steady containment. Crooked fences, manicured lawns, and even some of their precious tennis courts sat lower than my pond. If they wanted balance restored, then I would gladly give it to them. As I stood and looked down at the structure, the quiet determination in me hardened. I would fight them not just in court, but on the land itself. They wanted to play power games? Fine. But this was my home, my water, and my dam. And if they thought a $50,000 fine was going to make me bow my head, they didn't know me at all. The decision to drop the dam didn't come lightly, though once the thought took root, it grew stronger with every passing hour, like a storm cloud building on the horizon. At first, I tried to convince myself that maybe there was still some way to reason with the HOA to appeal to their humanity or at least their logic, but I knew better. These were the same people who once fined my neighbor, old Mrs. Carson, $500 for painting her shutters a shade of blue that wasn't on their approved palette. The same group who demanded a family take down their kid's treehouse because it was unsightly from a road. If they couldn't tolerate painted wood or children playing, then my dam, something that actually gave me a measure of independence they couldn't regulate, was always going to be a target. By the second evening after receiving their fine, I had my plan forming in my head. I stood on the ridge above the pond, surveying the expanse of water glistening in the moonlight. The dam had stood firm for over a decade, built with care and reinforced each spring after the thaw. But no man-made thing lasts forever, and I knew exactly where its weakest point was: the northern edge, where the soil was sandy and where I'd always meant to pack more stone. If I breached that section, the water would carve its own channel, cutting into the valley like a blade, and once the pressure began, there would be no stopping it. It would be sudden, violent, and complete. Still, there was part of me that hesitated, not because I feared the HOA, but because I respected the land itself. Releasing that much water at once was no small act. It would reshape the terrain, drown fields temporarily, and test every structure downstream. But then again, wasn't that nature's right? My dam had held the flow back for years, taming what was meant to be wild. All I would be doing is stepping aside and letting gravity and earth take their course. In a way, it felt almost poetic. The HOA, so desperate to punish me for controlling water, would get their wish for natural balance, but the balance nature chose was never gentle. It was fierce, unyielding, and blind to human property lines. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with images of the release, the rush of water tearing through fences, lawns turning to mud, and HOA board members standing helplessly in their perfectly pressed clothes as nature reclaimed what they thought they owned. By dawn, the hesitation had burned off like mist under the sun. I gathered my tools, a pickaxe, a shovel, and the old tractor with its rusted bucket that I kept more for nostalgia than utility. My dog trailed behind me, tail wagging, as if he knew an adventure was about to begin. I parked the tractor by the north end of the dam and studied the earthwork one last time. It struck me then just how much sweat and grit I had poured into building it all those years ago, and for a fleeting second, I felt a pang of regret. But it wasn't regret for myself. It was regret that something I had built to nurture the land had become twisted into a weapon used against me by people who didn't understand or care. With a deep breath, I swung the pickaxe into the soft earth, the sound of the strike echoing across the quiet valley. The first clumps of dirt crumbled away easily, tumbling down into the shallow trickle that seeped through the base. I worked steadily, alternating between pickaxe and shovel, widening the cut. At first, it was just a trickle, then a thin stream that hissed as it rushed past my boots. The soil gave way faster than I expected, and soon the flow was growing, deepening, and dragging stones with it. I stepped back, leaning on my shovel, and watched as the water found its freedom. What started as a stream grew into a torrent within minutes, tearing into the breach with relentless force. The sound was deafening, a roar that seemed to shake the ground itself. My dog barked and darted back, unsure whether to be afraid or excited. The pond that had been calm and glassy only hours before was now in upheaval, churning as its contents surged toward the opening. I stood there, heart pounding, unable to tear my eyes away, as years of stored water ripped through the valley like a beast uncaged. Downstream, I could already see the thin ribbon of the creek swelling into a muddy river, rising higher and faster than anything those carefully manicured backyards had seen in decades. I imagined sprinklers submerged, patio furniture swept away, and the smug faces of the HOA members turning pale as they realized their precious lawns and gardens were powerless against nature's hand. It was beautiful in a raw and terrifying way. I knew I had just crossed a line. There was no undoing what I'd done. But for the first time since receiving that fine, I felt free. Free from their petty rules, free from their illusion of authority, free from the idea that I had to conform to their shallow version of order. The water didn't care about bylaws or fines. It didn't recognize property lines or manicured hedges. It only cared about gravity and the path before it. And as I watched the valley transform before my eyes, I realized I had made the right choice. This wasn't destruction, it was restoration. By the next morning, the consequences of my choice had already started rippling through the community, both literally and figuratively. The valley below me looked entirely different than it had the day before. Where the creek had once been a narrow trickle winding its way quietly past houses, it was now a wide, muddy river carrying branches, debris, and silt downstream with a force that no one could ignore. From my porch, I could see flashes of movement as HOA members scurried about in panic, their neatly pressed shorts and polos smeared with mud as they tried to drag patio furniture and lawn ornaments away from the rising water. Some had sandbags hastily stacked by their porches, though it was laughable how ineffective they were against the surge that had carved itself through the earth overnight. News spread quickly, of course. By mid-morning, a convoy of SUVs had parked along the road leading into the subdivision, their owners yelling orders and flapping clipboards as if commanding troops on a battlefield. I knew most of them by sight, even if I had spent years avoiding their meetings. Marlene, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, shrieking at anyone who would listen about how this was criminal sabotage, her husband Bill, red-faced and furious, pointing at my property like it was the root of all evil, and a handful of others waving phones, recording the chaos as though documentation might give them some semblance of control. I could imagine the phone calls already being made to lawyers, county officials, and probably the local news station. But all the noise and outrage didn't bother me half as much as the smug satisfaction I felt in knowing that they were finally being forced to face the raw truth of the land they pretended to own. For years, they had built their dream homes as though nature itself could be bent into a neat grid, with lawns trimmed to perfection and sprinklers running on timers, ignoring the drought, ignoring the ecosystem, ignoring reality. They had accused me of hoarding, when in truth, I had been the only one respecting the balance, storing water when it was plentiful so it could be used responsibly later. My pond had created life. Their greed had created dependency. And now, stripped of that dam, they were seeing what nature really looked like without someone quietly managing it in the background. Around noon, I noticed 2 county trucks crawling up the dirt road toward my gate. I leaned on the fence, waiting as they pulled up, engines rattling and dust swirling behind them. Out stepped a pair of officials in khaki uniforms, clipboards in hand and expressions already tense with frustration. One introduced himself as watershed management, the other as environmental compliance, and both of them wasted no time accusing me of causing an environmental hazard. They spoke of violations, safety concerns, property damage, and liabilities, their voices sharp and practiced, like men who had read from the same script dozens of times before. I let them talk for a while before I answered, and when I finally did, I spoke plainly. I told them I had dismantled my own dam on my own property, which I had built with full legal rights years before the HOA even existed. I told them that water, once free, was now flowing as it was always meant to. Their problem wasn't with me, I explained. It was with gravity, with topography, with the fact that human beings couldn't dictate terms to a river. They didn't like that answer. I could see it in the way their jaws clenched and their pens scribbled furiously across their notepads. They wanted me to admit fault, to give them a reason to pass blame neatly from the HOA's shoulders onto mine. But I wasn't about to hand it to them. Instead, I invited them, politely, almost mockingly, to walk the breach with me, to see the dam's remains for themselves. They hesitated, but eventually followed as I led them down the slope. When they stood at the breach, looking at the raw cut where water now thundered through, I saw something flicker across their faces, respect, maybe, or fear. It was one thing to read about water flow and property lines in a manual. It was another to stand beside the sheer force of it, to feel the spray on your skin and the rumble in your bones. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and in that silence, I knew I had made my point. They eventually retreated back up the hill, muttering about further review and possible injunctions, but I could tell they were shaken. That night, I heard the first whispers of what would become the HOA's official narrative: that I had intentionally flooded the community as an act of revenge, that I was reckless, unstable, dangerous. Their stories twisted the truth into something darker, painting me as a villain rather than a landowner tired of being pushed around. But for every lie they told, there were dozens of witnesses who had seen their precious balance crumble before their eyes, who knew deep down that it wasn't me who had brought chaos, but nature itself. And as I sat on my porch, listening to the distant shouts and the hum of pumps already being brought in to drain basements, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Because for once, it wasn't me who was scrambling to justify myself. It was them. The following days were a blur of chaos, accusations, and desperate scrambling on the part of the HOA as they tried to contain both the floodwaters and the narrative. Trucks with county logos came and went, pumping equipment hummed day and night, and crews in reflective vests slogged through the muck to assess damages. From my porch on the hill, I had the perfect vantage point to watch it all unfold, a strange mix of theater and tragedy playing out below. Lawns once manicured within an inch of their lives were now pools of mud, decorative flower beds drowned, and several basements had become indoor ponds. Even the tennis courts, those symbols of HOA pride, were cracked with silt and strewn with debris. The irony was almost too perfect. For years they had criticized me, fined me, and called me selfish, but now their own overconfidence in controlling nature had turned against them. Instead of admitting their mistake, though, they doubled down. A special meeting was convened under a tent in the cul-de-sac where their board usually held seasonal BBQs, but this gathering had no burgers, no laughter, only angry voices carrying up to my property line. I could hear Marlene screeching about how I needed to be arrested, how they needed to file a lawsuit not just against me, but against the county for failing to regulate me. Bill's voice cut through the air as he shouted about emergency funds, insurance claims, and how they would ruin me financially to set an example. It might have rattled me if I hadn't already known the truth. The land and the water were on my side, and all the paperwork in the world couldn't erase that. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew they would throw everything they had at me: lawyers, inspectors, maybe even sheriffs with court orders. So I spent those days preparing as well. While they scrambled to pump water, I was documenting everything with photos and videos, not just of the breach, but of the downstream flooding that proved what I had always known. Their developments were built irresponsibly on land never meant for such fragile control. I dug out the old file where I had kept the original water rights documents from when I purchased the land, stamped and signed by the county clerk years before the HOA had even existed. I made copies of receipts for stone, concrete, and dredging work, proof that my dam had been responsibly built and maintained. In short, I armed myself with evidence, knowing the battlefield was shifting from mud and water to courtrooms and hearings. But what surprised me most during those days was how some of the very neighbors who had once whispered and complained about me began quietly reaching out. One evening, as the sun set over the soggy valley, Mrs. Carson, the same woman who had been fined over her blue shutters, climbed the hill to my porch carrying a basket of bread. She looked tired, her shoes caked in mud, but her eyes were kind. She told me she understood why I had done it, that the HOA had gone too far, and that plenty of people in the community were beginning to see them for what they were. Another neighbor, a young father whose kids used to sneak up to my pond to fish, stopped me at the feed store to say his house had flooded, but he didn't blame me. He blamed the board for ignoring warnings about poor drainage for years. Their words didn't erase the hostility from the HOA leaders, but they did remind me I wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The tide, in more ways than one, was beginning to turn. On the third day, as if to underline that point, a reporter from the local news station showed up at my gate. A young woman with a determined stride. She introduced herself, and asked if I'd be willing to give my side of the story. Apparently, the HOA had already painted me in the papers as a bitter recluse who had unleashed a flood out of spite, but she wanted to hear directly from me. I considered turning her away. After all, the media had a way of twisting things, but then I thought about how long the HOA had controlled the narrative unchecked. So, I invited her onto the porch, gave her coffee, and told her everything. How I had built the dam legally, how the HOA had harassed me for years, how they fined me $50,000 for hoarding water, and how I had simply decided to let the creek run free again. I spoke not with anger but with conviction, explaining that what they called hoarding was actually conservation, and what they called destruction was simply nature reclaiming its course. She listened intently, her recorder on the table between us, and when she left, I had the distinct feeling my words would carry further than the HOA expected. Sure enough, that evening the news aired a segment that showed not just the flooded lawns, but also me standing by the breach, explaining calmly that this was what happened when human arrogance tried to bend nature into submission. It was the first time I saw a crack in the HOA's armor. Their bluster suddenly looked more like desperation. Their endless threats about lawsuits were beginning to sound hollow compared to the images of angry residents questioning why their board had spent years picking fights over shutters and tree houses instead of preparing for real issues like drainage and flood planning. And as I sat on the porch that night, watching the stars glitter above the valley, I realized something important. I hadn't just defended my land. I had exposed their illusion of control. And that was a wound they wouldn't heal from easily. The storm between me and the HOA only grew fiercer after that news broadcast, and though I expected retaliation, I underestimated the sheer desperation with which they would try to claw back control of the narrative. Within 24 hours of my interview airing, I received not one but 3 certified letters shoved into my mailbox, each more threatening than the last. One accused me of gross negligence resulting in community damages and demanded immediate reparations in excess of $250,000, a laughable sum meant more to scare me than to reflect reality. Another claimed I had violated a dozen obscure HOA bylaws, none of which applied to me since my property had predated their existence. The third letter was the most telling. It warned me that unless I cooperated with their restoration committee, they would pursue criminal charges. I sat at my kitchen table with the letters spread out like cards in a poker game, shaking my head at their arrogance. They were bluffing, throwing wild numbers and threats in the hope that I would fold. But I had no intention of folding. If anything, their panic only steeled my resolve further. Over the next week, as floodwaters slowly receded, I watched the HOA scramble to repair their image. They hired contractors to dredge the creek. They held community cleanup days where board members posed for photos in rubber boots, and they even distributed glossy pamphlets claiming that they were working tirelessly to restore balance. It might have fooled outsiders, but it didn't fool the residents who were still hauling ruined furniture out of their basements or paying repairmen out of pocket while the HOA squabbled over whose insurance should cover what. And more importantly, it didn't fool me. I knew they weren't interested in balance. They were interested in control, in making sure that no one else in the valley ever dared to challenge them again. But something was shifting, and I could see it in the way people began to look at me differently. Instead of glares and whispers, I got nods of acknowledgement at the feed store, quick handshakes at the post office, and even a few quiet words of thanks from residents who admitted they were sick of the HOA's endless rules. They didn't say it too loudly, fear of retaliation still kept most in line, but I could tell the board's iron grip was slipping. Still, the board was relentless. One morning, I was jolted awake by the sound of heavy knocking on my front door. I opened it to find 2 sheriff's deputies standing there, hats low, expressions grim. They handed me a summons to appear in court filed by the HOA for damages and reckless endangerment. I read the papers slowly, my heart beating hard in my chest, but instead of fear, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was what I had been preparing for. They wanted a fight in court? Then I'd give them one. I spent the following days gathering every scrap of evidence I had, the water rights documents, the maintenance logs for the dam, photographs of the pond's wildlife, and even testimonies from neighbors who were willing to admit on record that the HOA had ignored drainage problems for years. I hired a lawyer too, a sharp-tongued woman named Claire, who had made a name for herself standing up to overreaching HOAs. When she heard my story, she smirked and said, "Sounds like they've been begging to lose this fight for years." With her at my side, I actually began to look forward to the day in court. But before that day arrived, something unexpected happened. Nature delivered another blow, one I hadn't seen coming but which ended up changing everything. A heavy rainstorm rolled through the valley one weekend, 3 days of relentless downpour that swelled the newly freed creek into a raging river once again. This time, though, it wasn't my pond bursting its banks. It was simply the weather doing what weather does. And without my dam slowing the flow, the water surged faster and stronger than it had in decades. By the second day, several houses were flooded worse than before, the tennis courts were submerged completely, and even parts of the HOA's own clubhouse had taken on water. I stood on my porch watching sheets of rain hammer down, realizing that the storm had proven my point better than I ever could. Nature was not meant to be caged, and my dam had never been the enemy, it had been the buffer protecting them all along. The storm passed, the skies cleared, and as the residents surveyed the new round of damage, something shifted permanently in their expressions. They no longer looked at me as the villain. They looked at me as the man who had warned them all along. They didn't say it outright, not yet, but I could see it in their eyes. The board's authority was cracking, and no matter how many fines or threats they issued, the community itself was beginning to turn against them. And that, I realized, was more powerful than any dam or flood. The weeks leading up to the court date felt like a slow-motion storm, every day charged with anticipation, whispers, and quiet battles being fought behind the scenes. The HOA board continued to pound their war drums, sending out newsletters stuffed into every resident's mailbox about the dangerous precedent I had set, warning that if I wasn't punished, the entire community would descend into lawless chaos. They painted pictures of me as some sort of renegade outlaw, a man who thought himself above rules and reason, and they tried to rally the residents by appealing to their fear rather than their sense of fairness. But while their words looked bold on paper, their effect in reality was waning. More and more residents had seen firsthand the consequences of the flood and the storm that followed, and they were beginning to realize the truth. The HOA had been hiding their own incompetence behind my pond. People stopped to talk to me in places they never would have before. A retired veteran from down the hill told me, "Son, that dam of yours was the only thing keeping this place steady. They just didn't want to admit it." A mother with 2 kids approached me at the feed store and whispered that she and her husband had been against the board's harassment from the beginning, but they were scared of fines and retaliation. It wasn't loud or public yet, but the tide was shifting, and I knew the board could feel it slipping through their fingers like mud in the flood. Meanwhile, Claire, my lawyer, was a force of nature herself. She came to the property several times, documenting everything with a precision that made me grateful I'd hired her. She photographed the breach, took samples of soil, even interviewed neighbors who were willing to speak under oath about the harassment I'd endured for years. She gathered every HOA letter, every fine, every ridiculous accusation, and stacked them neatly in folders that looked heavier than a law library. "They're trying to bury you in paper," she told me one afternoon as we spread documents across my dining table, "but they don't realize we've got the bedrock. This whole thing isn't about the dam. It's about control. And control is their addiction." Listening to her gave me hope, but I still couldn't shake the gnawing thought that this fight was bigger than me, bigger than one court case. What was on trial wasn't just my actions, but the idea that landowners, people who worked and cared for their property, still had rights in the face of overreaching associations that acted like petty kingdoms. If I lost, it wouldn't just be a fine or a foreclosure, it would be a precedent that said the board could crush anyone who dared to live differently. That thought fueled me during sleepless nights when I walked the property line with my dog, staring out at the valley that had become both home and battlefield. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse was buzzing with reporters, residents, and even a few protesters holding signs that read HOA tyranny ends here and let nature flow. I hadn't expected support like that, and seeing it gave me a jolt of confidence I hadn't felt since this all began. The board members showed up in force, Marlene leading the charge in her immaculate suit, her face pinched with anger. They strutted into the courtroom like generals marching into war, flanked by a team of lawyers in tailored suits. But what they had in style, they lacked in substance, and that became clear as soon as the hearing began. Their lawyers presented graphs, charts, and dramatic photographs of flooded basements, trying to paint me as reckless and destructive. They spoke in booming voices about community trust, endangerment, and unlawful manipulation of natural resources. At one point, Bill even stood to testify, his face red as he shouted about how my selfish pond had ruined his backyard koi pond. The theatrics might have impressed someone who didn't know better, but Claire dismantled their arguments with a surgeon's precision. She presented my water rights documents, the stamped county approvals, the maintenance logs showing I had acted responsibly for years. She called witnesses who testified that the HOA had ignored drainage issues long before I ever dropped the dam. She even presented photos of the flood damage after the storm that occurred weeks later, proving that nature itself, not me, was the true force reshaping the valley. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I told the judge about why I had built the dam, how it had created life, sustained my farm, and benefited the ecosystem. I explained how the HOA had harassed me for years, how they fined me for hoarding water during a drought, and how their $50,000 penalty had pushed me to a point of defiance. I admitted with no shame that I had breached my own dam, not to cause harm, but to give the water back its natural course, to show that no human committee could truly cage it. The courtroom was silent as I spoke, and for the first time in months, I felt like my voice wasn't being drowned out by threats and paperwork. When closing arguments were finished, the judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. The room held its breath as he delivered his decision. The HOA's lawsuit was dismissed. He acknowledged the damages downstream, but declared them an act of nature compounded by poor development planning, not a crime caused by me. He reminded the board that my water rights were legally established long before their association existed, and that their attempts to fine me were an overreach of authority. His final words cut sharper than any I could have hoped for. This court does not recognize control disguised as governance. The board members sat stunned, their mouths open as the gavel struck. And though I knew the war wasn't over, that they would scheme, plot, and probably come after me again, I had won the first real battle. As I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, cameras flashing and neighbors clapping me on the back, I realized something profound. I hadn't just defended my land, I had cracked the foundation of their empire. And once the cracks began, the whole structure would eventually fall. The aftermath of the court victory was almost more satisfying than the verdict itself, because it exposed just how fragile the HOA's power really was once people stopped being afraid of them. For years, they had operated like petty monarchs, lording over their neighbors with fines, rules, and threats of foreclosure, but now their masks were slipping, and the community was beginning to see them for what they truly were: a handful of self-serving bullies with clipboards. In the weeks that followed the dismissal, cracks spread through the board's ranks like fractures in old stone. Residents who had once bowed their heads in silence began questioning the necessity of half the HOA's rules. A man down the street mowed his lawn on the wrong day just to see if anyone would say something, and when no one did, he mowed diagonally the next week for good measure. Someone else parked an RV in their driveway for 3 days, daring the board to fine them. And when they didn't, whispers spread that the board was toothless. Even the families who had lost the most in the flood began shifting their anger away from me and onto the people who had promised them security but delivered nothing but bureaucracy. At the next monthly meeting, which was usually an echo chamber of Marlene's orders, residents showed up in numbers that surprised everyone. Voices rose, fingers pointed, and questions flew. Why had thousands of dollars been spent on decorations for the clubhouse instead of drainage improvements? Why did the board waste time fining people over flower colors instead of preparing for real issues? Why was a $50,000 fine issued against me when they had no legal standing? Marlene tried to shout over them, waving her hands and demanding order, but the crowd no longer listened. The seed of rebellion had been planted, and it was growing faster than she could stomp it out. Watching from a distance, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered every nasty letter, every smug threat, every attempt to strip me of the home I had built with my own hands. No, pity wasn't the right word. What I felt was justice. Yet, despite their crumbling authority, the board didn't give up completely. Pride is a stubborn thing, and theirs was wounded deeply. They tried to appeal the judge's ruling, though that was quickly dismissed. They sent out desperate newsletters insisting they were still the governing body of this community and that anyone ignoring the rules would face serious consequences. But those threats rang hollow now. The residents had tasted freedom, and once you taste it, there's no going back to blind obedience. Some even came to me directly, standing awkwardly on my porch as they thanked me for standing up to the board. They didn't call me a hero, most were too proud for that, but their gratitude was real, and in their eyes I saw something stronger than praise, respect. That respect was worth more than any fine, any victory, any headline. It meant that maybe, just maybe, the valley could finally start to heal, not just from the flood, but from the years of control it had endured. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think the battle was over. The HOA might have been weakened, but like a wounded animal, they were unpredictable and dangerous. I kept careful watch over my land, repaired the areas where the dam had breached, and even considered rebuilding, not to restore the pond to its former glory, but to create a new kind of barrier, one that worked with the creek rather than against it. I wanted to show, once again, that stewardship of the land was possible without strangling it into submission. The idea took root in my mind, a system of terraces and natural wetlands that would slow the water, provide habitat, and prove beyond doubt that I had never been hoarding but rather protecting. If the HOA wanted to spin their lies, let them. The land itself would tell the truth. One evening, as I stood by the breach with my dog on my side, I thought about how far I'd come since that first notice nailed to my gate. Back then, I had felt isolated, surrounded, almost hopeless against their machine. Now, I felt something entirely different. I felt unshakable. They had thrown everything at me, fines, threats, lawsuits, even smear campaigns, and yet here I stood, my home intact, my rights affirmed, and my neighbors slowly awakening to the truth. The sound of the freed creek rushing through the valley was like a hymn to me, a reminder that no matter how hard men tried to control it, nature always had the final word. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, one the HOA had never understood. Control is an illusion. Power is temporary. But respect for the land, for nature, for freedom, that endures. The final chapter of this long war with the HOA didn't end with a bang, but rather with a slow collapse that felt both inevitable and strangely anticlimactic. Months passed after the court battle, and though the board members tried desperately to cling to their titles, their authority eroded like soil in the flood. Attendance at meetings dwindled, volunteers for their so-called committees vanished, and even their once prized newsletters became little more than paper reminders of their fading influence. The turning point came when the county finally stepped in to review the HOA's finances. Years of mismanagement, questionable spending, and outright negligence came to light, and suddenly, those who had once been so eager to wield power were scrambling to distance themselves from the very organization they had built. One by one, board members resigned, some in shame, others in bitterness, until only Marlene was left. She tried to carry the banner alone, but without the weight of numbers behind her, she was just one angry woman shouting into the void. By the end of the summer, the HOA formally dissolved, its accounts seized, its rules nullified, and its existence relegated to the same fate as my old dam. Washed away, powerless against the current of truth and time. When the news broke, I didn't throw a party, I didn't gloat, and I didn't march through town declaring victory. Instead, I went down to the creek, the same creek they had once accused me of hoarding, and I watched it flow unimpeded through the valley. It was cleaner now, freer, its banks alive with green growth that hadn't been there in years. Birds darted through the air, frogs croaked from the shallows, and the sound of rushing water filled me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. My land, once the center of endless disputes, was finally just my land again. No fines nailed to my gate, no threats in my mailbox, no deputies knocking at my door. Just me, my home, and the steady rhythm of nature. But what surprised me most in the weeks after the HOA's fall wasn't the silence from my old enemies, but the voices of my neighbors. People who had once avoided me, who had whispered that I was reckless or selfish, began stopping by to ask questions about the creek, the land, even the wildlife that had returned. Families who had lost the most in the floods wanted to learn how to protect their property better, not through rules and bylaws, but through real, practical stewardship. And slowly, I found myself teaching them, showing them how the terraces worked, how to plant water-loving grasses, how to build with nature rather than against it. The man who once complained about his flooded basement now planted willow trees by the water's edge to help soak up excess runoff. A young family with 2 kids built a small rain garden in their yard, learning to channel the water instead of fighting it. Even the retired couple down the road, who had once filed the loudest complaints against me, came by one evening with homemade pie and asked if I'd help them design a natural barrier around their property. I said yes, not because I needed their thanks, but because it felt like the right thing to do. The valley had been divided for so long, torn apart by rules and resentment, but now, without the HOA's shadow hanging over it, there was a chance for real community to grow. As the months turned into a year, the transformation was undeniable. The freed creek carved new paths, the wildlife flourished, and the people who lived along its banks finally began to see it not as an enemy to be controlled, but as a partner to be respected. And in that change, I found a sense of redemption, not only for myself, but for everyone who had suffered under the false promise of control. One evening, standing at the breach where my dam had once stood tall, I realized the irony of it all. They had fined me $50,000 for hoarding water, for daring to hold on to something that belonged to the land itself. But in trying to punish me, they had unleashed forces they couldn't contain, forces that destroyed their authority, exposed their corruption, and ultimately freed the valley from their grip. The fine that had once seemed like a crushing weight was now nothing more than a footnote in a much larger story, one of resilience, justice, and the enduring power of truth. As the sun dipped low and painted the water in gold, I smiled to myself, knowing that I had not only outlasted them, but also proven something far more important. That no man, no board, no HOA, no matter how arrogant, can ever truly control nature. You can dam it, you can fine it, you can try to bend it to your will, but in the end, nature always reclaims what is hers. And standing there with the creek flowing strong and free, I felt a deep certainty that so long as I respected that truth, I too would always remain free,